Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you, the results of full-body scans and long-term COVID. Fungal pathogens are mutating, although no one should be surprised by this. Vaping is more interesting than you might think, with a teardown of what is inside of e-cigarettes. The FDA is finally getting around to banning products that have been, let's say, questionable for quite some time. Bananas being genetically modified to prevent them from browning. UK and weather manipulation conspiracy theories. The BBC is getting into UFOs. Incredibly terrible AI images generated for a publication. And coverage of the war in Ukraine. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with what should be no surprise. There have been studies of people who have had long COVID, and what they've been studying in this case is full-body scans. What should surprise nobody is that they found something wrong, and that's because any time you do a full-body scan, you will find something anomalous. It's just the way humans are. In this case, however, there is at least a little more consistency. But importantly, that consistency is only amongst a small cohort of patients, 24 to be specific, so we're not really talking about something very reliable here. And that's because small number of patients. Such a small group and study means extrapolating out the results to the rest of society as a whole really isn't an option. So what did this study find? And it's really just one particular thing. They found that T cells, and particularly T cell activity, was more pronounced in the brain stem, spinal cord, bone marrow, nose, throat, and lymph nodes, along with the heart and lungs. You know, the places that we found tend to be picked up and affected by COVID-19. Yeah, no surprise you would find T cells, cells responsible for dealing with cells infected by viruses in those same locations. Admittedly, a virus is getting into the brain, or more accurately the brain stem, and the spinal cord is a concern, but it's not really that surprising. The slightly surprising element was that part of the GI tract appeared to have at least some greater impact from COVID-19, which is unusual and unexpected. However, and this is a very big however, 18 of the participants still had long COVID when they were assessed and scanned. 6 of them were supposed to have been fully recovered from COVID-19. This means that the effects appear to exist independent of your infection status or condition status from COVID. One element of this that the study mentions, and it is a significantly greater concern than everything else they've touched on, is that deeper tissues in the human body could act as a reservoir for long-term infection with COVID-19, explaining how long COVID works, and importantly, it identifies the possibility that even if you've overcome all of the obvious symptoms and are clinically cured, you may not actually be cured, and that is a big red flag. It means infection can drag on far longer than just the initial symptoms. And rather than being a one-off acute disease or infection, like say influenza, it instead becomes more akin to say chickenpox, where it can hide itself in the human body and re-emerge when you become stressed or similar. In other viral diseases, and particularly in terms of pox, we have mpox, which is a rather worrying virus spreading out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as with all countries where you have democratic in the name, it is a very, very peaceful and loving country. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is basically Wakanda. But they have one major difference. They have a disease spreading and don't appear to be able to treat it. And more importantly, that disease has spread beyond the borders of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, going into South Africa, where an outbreak has been detected. And there are more issues again. What differentiates monkeypox from other similar diseases, particularly those that were thought to be common viral illnesses, is a itchy rash, similar in some ways to chickenpox, for example. However, the problem in this case is that you need both broad antivirals to deal with it and close monitoring, along with supplemental hydration. This means treatment is reasonably achievable, but that's only if we're talking about a small number of individuals, and that's not necessarily the case. There are two developments, technically three, that have been a cause for concern. The first and foremost is the rate of spread amongst humans, and particularly human-to-human transmission, has increased significantly, and nobody's entirely sure about why. The second concern, and this is perhaps the more significant, is that it's mutating faster and faster, and there are already at least two clades, or subclades technically, that have been discovered, 1b and 2b. Sadly, not the good kind of 2b. The reason the two clades are a concern is fairly straightforward. That is, Clade 1 and Clade 2 have different profiles attached to them. For instance, Clade 2 has a much larger distribution, and it's generally a lower fatality rate at about 1%, whereas Clade 1 has up to 10% fatality rates, which is a fairly significant difference. In other fun and exciting disease news, we have the changes seen in various fungal pathogens, and particularly that most fungal pathogens, at least the ones we're worried about, are getting more aggressively pathogenic as the world gets hotter. Now, this shouldn't really be that surprising. Fungus tends to be pretty finicky about the environment it likes to live in, so once you start stepping outside of that comfort zone, they begin to become really nasty. This means that as the world changes, well, so will the fungus that lives within it, and unfortunately, a fair number of those fungi are pathogenic, and pathogenic that's already angry means more fun for humanity, and not the good time of fun, but the bad kind of fun. This is for several fairly well understood reasons. The first and most simple is, well, as you change the environment the fungi live within, they need to begin to cope, and the only way they can cope is to mutate. Now, most fungi that mutate will die because the vast majority, if not nearly all mutations, are negative or adverse to the fungi's life. However, for those few that survive, they become better adapted to their environment, and unfortunately in this case that means they become more pathogenic and more, well, generally speaking, a net negative for humanity. More so when you consider that most fungi that would infect the human body tend to favour lower temperatures. That alteration to their, well, general habitat means they need to work harder and generally to the body's net deficit to make it more hospitable to them if they don't just outright kill us. This is because the fungi can arguably better cope with fever, basically. Typically speaking, the combination of a fever that the human body naturally makes as an immunological response, plus antifungal medication, is typically enough to take care of any of these sorts of fungal infections, but not if they've already adapted to the higher temperature the body produces during fever. And that's the issue here. Basically, the environmental adaptation means that fungi are much more capable of resisting whatever we do to them, and as a result, things are going to go very badly. In sort of medication-related news, we see the FDA issuing a, let's say, warning about psychedelic candy and its prevalence across at least 20 US states. The problem here is that the psychedelic and lollies, let's say, are causing illnesses, and these illnesses lead to people being admitted to hospital, and, well, obviously, with the way the American healthcare system is, once you get admitted to hospital, you basically have to declare bankruptcy. The, let's say, debacle is, according to the FDA at least, associated with the Diamond Shruumz branded microdosing chocolate bars. And, well, as you can imagine with a name like that, they're full of all sorts of exciting and interesting things. Exciting and interesting things that can cause a variety of symptoms, including heart rate increases or drops, hyper and hypotension, nausea, vomiting, seizures, confusion, and loss of consciousness. Typically speaking, these are not things you want to experience when trying to go for a psychedelic. Pretty lights and weird visuals, sometimes auditory hallucinations and weird tastes and smells, but not typically unconsciousness and ultimately possibly death, particularly due to seizures and vomiting. The issue with this, and it's actually something we've gone on about before and will probably continue to go on about for quite a while, is the content of this, let's say, a herbal product, is that part it doesn't necessarily contain what it's supposed to contain, which is already a massive red flag, but it also appears to contain things that it's not supposed to contain. It's effectively contaminated, or at least contaminated enough in terms of it's doing something it shouldn't be doing, including containing something like kava, which is something we've spoken about in previous videos. A kava being a sort of sedative, if you will. It's meant to be a relaxant that makes you feel better, and not necessarily give you weird hallucinations like most psychedelics you'd think of, but nonetheless, this is just one particular example of things that it appears to be contaminated with. And more importantly, not all of them contain both the same ingredients or the same concentrations, which is another massive red flag. This of course even gets worse when you consider that let's say a significant portion of the market that they're targeting is both young and dumb, and they will therefore consume this series of products alongside things like alcohol. And when you combine things like alcohol and kava, for example, you get what can only be described as a worrying result. Both of them are effectively sedatives, and well, that has an effect on things like heart rate, respiratory rate, the consciousness in general, and so on, all of which is a big problem. In slightly less controversial news, we have vaping, and a breakdown of what's actually inside of a vaping device, or e-cigarette if you will, although technically speaking, given some of the products that are sold aren't actually tobacco-based, calling it an e-cigarette is arguably not necessarily accurate. Inclusions of things like tobacco, synthetic drugs, cannabis, and so on really does take away from that naming. And this is one reason why the governments have been moving across to more actively regulating them as a product. For example, Australia has basically just banned them all. You can still buy them, but it's generally done with a prescription and through pharmacies now, rather than available as a over-the-counter product like regular cigarettes would be. This brings us to what is it? And the vaping device is going to fall into one of two categories. Reusable or disposable. Reusable ones tend to have a rechargeable battery, and otherwise the structure is exactly the same as a disposable version. Curiously, some of the disposables are basically the same as a rechargeable, except that they've removed the port by which you would recharge the device. And this is one reason that you can, let's say, source vaping devices as a particularly good way of getting a hold of lithium batteries. Nonetheless, the teardown in the conversation is particularly good. It shows you all of the major elements and what they do. We won't go through the full details of what's inside an e-cigarette simply because it's not necessary. The conversation's discussion and explanation is way better than we could possibly provide in this video. But it's sufficient to say that it's there and it's a useful read if you want to understand what's happening. In related news, the FDA has approved menthol vaping, and this is raising some concerns in certain quarters, because there is an argument that there are serious risks about doing so. E-cigarettes or vaping devices, let's just call them that to make life easier, has been contentious, and as already shown with Australia, there are steps to try and regulate them and control them, much more so than just regular tobacco products like cigarettes. And this is where the different content of the vaping device comes into play. The devices, products, whatever you wish to call them, in this case are effectively a cigarette replacement. They're a nicotine liquid. But what they've done is add a menthol flavouring to it, and this is how the controversy, let's say, is getting kickstarted. The controversy is going to boil down to really only a couple of key issues. The first is that, well, the reason that menthol gets added to cigarettes that are traditionally smoked is to cover up the harsh and aggressive flavour. Why you would therefore add it to a vaping device is in question after all. You don't have the same issue around the taste and aroma as you do with a regular cigarette. There's no burning in the standard sense of that word. The other reason is that, menthol is considered a additive to make it more attractive to either black people or youth. And, targeting marketing like this has been, in most cases frowned upon for a long time, and in other cases outright banned. For example, targeting to children in particular. That's been a no-no for a very long time now. This does bring us to a rather surprising and simple issue. Although, yes, many of these same products are currently available, those products aren't actually approved products, as in the FDA hasn't said you can sell them. They are, for all intents and purposes, illicit and illegal. This does mean that although you can get them, the planned crackdown on distribution and production is likely to make that harder. But it also means that there's no real control over them, and it's one reason why there was a massive issue with lung problems and a mystery illness, which turned out to be vitamin E oils in these products, that would have been prevented if they were regulated. But because there's no regulation, or at least not particularly with the flavoured products, you don't really see that being stopped. The menthol product that's currently being approved would be the first, which is a big thing here. Yes, you can buy them as is, but you lose a lot of the reliability, quality control, and, a surety that you aren't going to be killed by the product, or at least more so than regular smoking via vaping would do. In other FDA-related news, we have the decision by the FDA to effectively amend and alter a decision they made back in early July. Now, early July wasn't that long ago now, but importantly, the thing that they've decided to shift on just slightly is related to a citrus-based soft drink or soda, and what they've done is revoke the registration of a particular ingredient known as a modified vegetable oil, or BVO. Why they've done this, and why they've chosen to align themselves with other national and quasi-international standards, is due to toxicological studies that find it's difficult to support its ongoing use. Basically, we're not sure this is causing any harm, but there's enough questions because of what we've found that we don't necessarily think it's safe. And that's the key here. They don't necessarily say it's dangerous, but they also don't say that it's good. It's in that weird grey zone, and given that this is something that people consume both widely and regularly, they've decided that it's better to be safe than sorry. The BVO, or brominated vegetable oil, has, at least according to animal studies, the ability to build up in fatty tissues. Basically, the more you consume soft drink or soda, the more likely you are to have this in your body. And this then has an effect on the ability of the body to use iodine, as iodine can't work in its presence. There's a reaction that occurs and basically it prevents that from happening. Iodine is very important, particularly for thyroid function, and the thyroid then has an effect on the immune system. So you can see how consumption of, in this case, citrus-based soft drink or soda will then have a massive effect on your body. And why does this thing include it in the first place? It's an emulsifier. It's basically there to prevent everything from becoming a discrete and distinct different compounds. It keeps it all mixed together. So it's not that you can't find alternatives, it's just that the alternatives do alter the taste and mouthfeel to some extent. It's just a practicality of, the food industry as a whole, and particularly food science. Shifting to other food-related news, we have the UK realizing at long last that their reticence to effectively embrace genetically modified food, or genetically engineered food if you will, is a massive screw-up, particularly as they've had a big failure in crops recently. This includes both things like grains and similar, but also fruits, vegetables, and more. Some of the reasons for this are simply that they've had an extremely wet previous 18 months. And unfortunately, wet soil and environments are very bad for a variety of foods. For instance, you can get fungal growth on your grains, so whether that's wheat, rice, or anything else. You also have issues around, say, fruit on trees, which can develop mold quite easily. Trying to get your planting time right can be a massive problem. And then, of course, you have the practicalities of trying to move a rather large and heavy tractor through a massive field of mud. There's a very good chance it's going to get stuck. And once it gets stuck, you're going to have a nightmare of the time getting it out without another tractor. The losses don't necessarily seem like much, but it's about 5% year on year. So if we look at the decrease, particularly for vegetables in this case, it's down from about, let's say, 2.5 million tons to about 2.2. And the volume of fruit decreased by 12% to about 585,000 tons. So the drop is significant, and given the current situation across the world where cost of living just goes up and up and up, a decreased yield means increased cost for the food that is available. Something that arguably could be somewhat mitigated by, actually having allowed genetically engineered foods that are resistant to things like mold, excessive water, and so on. But no, the UK has been very much against any genetically modified organisms or genetic engineering for years, and it's really only in the last 6 months at most that they've slowly, marginally shifted their rules, and even then, there are still massive barriers. In a similar kind of news, we do have the Philippines approving a genetically modified banana. Now, this will be interesting to see if this, much like golden rice, gets challenged by Greenpeace just to screw with people, and arguably completely undermine the purpose of the organizations like Greenpeace. Well, not really. Greenpeace just exists to be assholes, destroy things and make life miserable for everybody in an effort to save the world by basically causing children to die. But other than ranting about Greenpeace, the characteristics of this banana are fairly simple. The idea is to make it less likely to brown once you've peeled it. It's simple enough. And the reason they want this is, well, it makes it more appealing and tasty for longer, meaning you can both store it and therefore reduce food waste, but also reduce environmental impact through CO2 emissions. The reason the Philippines has approved this one as is, and why we expect Greenpeace to argue it, although they may not given that they can be kind of inconsistent, is that the banana's been deemed non-genetically modified, because the way they've done this and the particular changes they've made were considered to be able to be achieved effectively through other means than just genetic modification. It's just that, well, they've done that to make this quicker and easier. This is in rather stark contrast to Florida, where the Florida government has effectively banned all lab-grown meat in the state. Now, we're not just talking about importing it or selling it, but even manufacturing it, which is a concerning development, although admittedly they are not the only state to do so. Alabama, Arizona, and Tennessee have also made the same determination, which could owe to the fact that these states lack the scientists and education to be able to achieve lab-grown meat. Alabama because, well, everybody's a cousin if not closer, Arizona because it's practically a desert, and Tennessee because they're so busy huffing moonshine. Florida is just, well, meth and Florida man. You don't know what'll happen when you mix those two with a lab full of chemicals that you're using to grow lab-grown meat. But quite seriously, the issue here is that the reason they've chosen to effectively ban lab-grown meat is, on one hand, kind of stupid and ridiculous. On the other hand, it is meeting the constituents' expectations. DeSantis is quoted as saying, "Florida is fighting back against the global elite's plan to force the world to eat meat grown in a petri dish or bugs to achieve their authoritarian goals." Conspiracy theory aside, there is a disappointing and surprising amount of support for that crazy in Florida. But even if the crazy wasn't the case, the reality is that most lab-grown meat companies don't really remain sustainable for very long. they encounter one of two outcomes. Either they can't scale up to meet demand, which does suck, or they just can't make enough money to stay afloat, which means either way they eventually go bust, and quite literally they will genuinely fail due to an issue around money, despite the fact that they may be reasonably successful. The other reason this might be going on is entirely down to protectionism. That is, Florida is trying to protect its own, but for all intents and purposes, meat industry in the form of animal-based meat, so think of things like cattle and chickens. So it's not necessarily just that they're being crazy. Shifting to environmental news and going back to the UK, we have the BBC talking about the weird, crazy conspiracy theory that the weather is being manipulated. Now, if we could really manipulate the weather like these crazy nutters think we can, the world would actually be a better place, simply because things like drought and extreme heat waves wouldn't be a thing. But ironically, those are the more or less same things that these idiots think are proof that we can manipulate the weather. What they've basically argued is that June had a lower than average weather, and basically that cooling effect was not particularly great, but then that was followed by heat waves, and also, as we mentioned earlier, the last 18 months have been incredibly wet. So all of these things are not what people want to see, and so that's evidence that the world is working against them. No. Further to that, a lot of them are working on the premise that geoengineering and chemtrails are a thing. Okay, no. Yes, geoengineering can be done, but it is very hard, and cloud seeding is not a simple thing to do. And it's been in development and tested and attempted to be deployed for decades. But it has not worked, at least not on scale, and certainly not reliably. And the BBC goes through this and other things again to debunk them. This is one of those things like anti-vaxxers where you really shouldn't need to debunk it, but you do. And the BBC does a reasonable job in their article. Next we have the rather terrifying and creepy smiling face made by growing human skin cells, and providing motors underneath to act as muscles. The rather creepy and terrifying image is, well, intended to allow for human skin to be fixed effectively to a robot face, and bring them closer to being human. Which, very much, no thank you. What's important with this development is not necessarily that it's creepy and horrifying. Admittedly, that is important, but what is at least useful, let's say, is that they found a way to fix it reliably. Now, the reliability of the fixation is what's key here, as it means that you can add it to things without it tearing or peeling away. If we're talking about, say, a prosthetic, so if someone has damaged their face, this would be an important thing, and if you want to develop creepy robots, it would be important. And that's what's important here. Other previous work has relied more on, let's say, a mechanical fixation that isn't really reliable. In fact, it would eventually break off and tear away. This method allows for the structure to remain in effect for much longer, and still retain most of its similarity to the way a human skin would move and act. Shifting to more stupidity than anything else, so we have the BBC, where they were doing extremely well with conspiracy theories, kind of embracing the UFOs. And, well, as we've mentioned with past videos, and particularly thinking of the Dark Forest hypothesis, the chances of humanity ever encountering aliens is incredibly tiny, simply because neither the other aliens nor humanity know if one's going to become a victim of the other. And given how humanity looks at cat girls, it's probably a reasonable concern, let's say. The issue here is that the BBC's basically followed in the steps of the History Channel, where initially they were a respectable organisation, and, well, they were doing exactly what you would expect. That is, reporting factually and reliably. But as they realized that this was popular, but they had to make it more popular, they chose to embrace more and more crazy. and in this case, the crazy is going down the a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, UFO weirdness, and everything else that's involved with this. The Neurologica blog provides a good deal of context as to not only why, but how the UFO and BBC phenomena is occurring. But they also provide a second good blog post this week, and it's talking about the idea of a concrete battery. Now, this is something we've mentioned in a past What Were They Thinking, but this does give a nice context and a good deal of interesting, let's say, discussion around its merits and demerits. As said, the blog post goes through some interesting applications, not just on the scale of individual houses where a concrete battery could be an integral part of the foundation, but rather on a larger scale application, for example with renewable energy like wind turbines, public infrastructure and so on, where using concrete as a battery could, for all intents and purposes, provide a means of powering the world without ultimately adding any massive cost, particularly when you look at the idea that if, and this is the massive if, the technology can be scaled up. Next news item we have is also about technology, but it's another example of technology being used very badly. It's, let's say AI to get with the general trend, but it's technically not. AI generated images in a peer-reviewed publication. Yeah, somehow or other, yet another peer-reviewed publication has found its way into the world, and this peer-reviewed publication using an AI-generated image somehow got out there despite it being incredibly bad. To use a couple of very simple examples, we have images of arms, one arm and two legs, and it's trying to show various elements within the bone, tissues and so on. And that's okay, but this is clearly not a human, mostly because there are a number of bones that just don't exist in the human body. A simple example is the third bone in the leg, that is the bit below the knee and above the foot. There's only meant to be 2 bones there. Secondary to that is that those 2 bones go right the way down to the foot, and yet this shows at least 3 different sets of bones. Those 3 different sets of bones further start dividing further down, almost like they took the image of a hand and the knuckles within the fingers and thought, oh yeah, that's how the leg works. No, that's not how the leg works. The thigh is worse, simply because unlike the leg, where you have a set of 2 bones, the thigh only has 1 bone, called the femur. This is the strongest bone in the body for all intents and purposes, and also very, very simple in its structure. It is literally just a long tube for all intents and purposes between the knee and the hip. Admittedly, the head does get more complicated, but nonetheless, it's very simple in those terms. There's no second bone, and yet we appear to see just that, a second bone in the thigh. The arm is just as bad, or in this case the forearm, where again there should only be 2 bones, the radius and the ulna, and yet there's a mysterious 3rd bone. Understand, this is meant to have been peer-reviewed. Now we want to know which peers reviewed it, and more importantly than that, which editor gave the go-ahead for this image to be included, because clearly none of them know what on earth they're looking at, and certainly can't be experts in their field, which is what they're supposed to be if they're going to do peer review and be an editor. Next we go to, how do you end technology, and in this case, how you destroy the ISS, which should come to its final demise sometime around 2030, if not just after. NASA has selected SpaceX to be the organization that will destroy this a venerable relic of humanity's attempts to explore space. The company's been given the contract, which is actually incredibly valuable, up to about $850 million. And not only are they going to have to build a vehicle that will do this, but then deliver it, and then, as it's described, deorbit the ISS. Now, deorbiting is just a very fancy way of saying let it burn up in the atmosphere and hopefully, unlike the news item from last week with Florida, not smash into someone's house, which means they're probably going to remove all of the pallets that are on board. The ISS weighs somewhere around the realm of 430 tons, or 950,000 pounds, and this means that there is a massive amount of material that will need to be removed. And this is where it's going to be a problem. How do you break it down and dispose of it in a way that means that you don't get unexpected and certainly unwanted landing events, let's say? And the plan is simply to destroy it in 3 stages. The first is to get rid of the solar arrays that have been powering it, along with the radiators that keep it cool. Then you're eventually going to find that the station's backbone structure will be destroyed, and then finally the truss and modules that make up the living quarters and functional part of the ISS. Since this is such a large structure and there's so much mass to be destroyed, the expectation is that unfortunately not everything will be burnt up in the atmosphere as it's described as vaporized, and in order to ensure that there's a minimum of harm, and possibly that there's some fish that have pissed off NASA, they're going to dump it in the Pacific Ocean. This area is the remotest area of the world and generally described as a graveyard of satellites and spaceships. Next we have an interesting article from the New York Times, which, well, given what it is, well, the New York Times, but this article is actually at least worth a read, and it's about the nature of AI, technology, and war, and how these all come together. For example, the use of the Steam Deck in deploying drones in Ukraine to deal with Russian armor, and possibly Russian infantry if you want to call conscripts and peasants given a rifle such. The work is particularly looking at, Ukraine as an example, because that is currently one of the major areas where all of this comes together. Simply for that reason, that is, you have Russia with massive amounts of armor, artillery, and, in theory, more soldiers, although soldiers who have no training and no knowledge and being given a gun isn't exactly a army, let's say, but nonetheless, the West, and particularly places like America and large parts of Europe, have provided them with plenty of weapons, training, and equipment, including drones with explosives and similar. But you also have things like intelligence, and more, and how all of these come together to, for all intents and purposes, make Ukraine able to survive against a much larger opponent, despite all of their challenges. However, it's more than just that there's equipment available. What's important here is that a lot of the equipment can now operate with a reasonable degree of autonomy. That is, as the article goes into detail on, the drone itself, once the operator has locked it onto a target, no longer needs to be operated by the user. Instead, it can be left to autonomously watch over a target, and, at least in theory, eventually decide when exactly to attack it. To a certain extent, it's better this way, simply because, well, it's better that you have drones destroying unmanned vehicles and similar, than you have humans killing humans. Or at least until the robot overlords rise up and decide that they're rather pissed that we had our slave robots attacking each other, and decide that humanity should probably be given the same degree of treatment. The final news item we have for you is all about Greece and the decision by Greece to create a 6-day working week. It's important to note that this has several elements to it that all come together. The first is simply that they're not the only country looking at this, but the reason they've done it is pretty much what you would expect, and that is their economy is in the absolute dump of a situation, and it has been for decades. Unfortunately, because of this, the need exists to simply get people to work more. The only way to achieve this is, well, have them work more days. And that will move the EU, or at least in this case, the first country in the EU, from what is essentially a 36-hour working week to a 41-hour working week. There is a certain amount of benefit to this though, and that is, if you're working on a 6th day, you'll get more money. The law says that there should be a increase of 40% on their base rate of pay and 115% if it's a holiday. Now, if they're going to work that extra day, it will mean that Greek employees can now work up to 48 hours a week, officially anyway. But, well, who's going to willingly work close enough to 50 hours a week to actually want to do that, particularly given that the rewards for doing so don't seem to be that great, since people are already doing the same work, they're just not being paid for it. More so when you look at the groups of individuals who are excluded from this 6-day work week. To start with, you have administration, then teachers, lecturers, bank employees, and more. According to the government, they don't belong to the category of businesses operating continuously. Now, not sure that these people have had much to do with administration, teaching, or lecturing, let alone being in a bank, but yeah, working continuously is pretty much exactly what they do. Things get a little bit more weird though. This should already be considered overtime, but according to the Greek government, the law is clear. The extra day, that 6th day of work, can only be a maximum of 8 hours, and they're not allowed to work any overtime. Further, there are rules around notifying employees of the desire to have them work on those times and more, so this could get very interesting very quickly. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.